Good evening, everybody. I'm Tim Frenner. I'm the host of this evening's live conversation with Cal Flyn, author of Islands of Abandonment, which is our, what month are we in? September, October book for Beyond Adventure, which is going to stop being called Beyond Adventure next month. And next month, Beyond Adventure ends, but it doesn't really, it's just having a rebrand. So Beyond Adventure is going to become Deep Ink, because we're launching some new subscriptions. So there's going to be a full spectrum of subscriptions. So as well as Deep Ink, which is for deeper reads, and sends an extra book every 2 months, we're going to have a lighter touch version of Adventurous Ink as well, which is just going to send one book every 2 months. And that's going to be called Slow Ink. So we've got Slow Ink, Adventurous Ink, and Deep Ink. Anyway, you'll hear much more about that next month. That's next month's excitement. But don't worry, the content of Beyond Adventure isn't going anywhere. It's just the name that's going to change. Anyway, enough of that, because we've got so much to talk to Cal about this evening. It's such an epic book. I loved it. But what I particularly love, occasionally I get sent books quite a lot, but I've never had one that came with, because obviously I write a little handwritten letter. I've never had such a lovely handwritten letter as this that came from Cal. And it was even bound with, I've lost it, but it was bound beautifully. Was it some sort of natural twine?
Yes, a bit of twine, yeah. Just a bit of dressing. Why not?
It was lovely. Well, it worked. But to be fair, you didn't need to sell it to me, because I think it's a brilliant book. And I think the reason I think it's a brilliant book is because we spend a lot of time thinking about the natural world and nature and reading about it. And we often do that by immersing ourselves in the natural world. But I think what Cal's done here is sort of done the inverse and looked at the natural world through a very different perspective of looking at man's influence on it and what happens when man removes themselves from the environment. So I thought it did exactly what we're looking for in Deep Ink, which is give us that really different perspective. So thank you for reaching out, Cal. It's brilliant. I'm sure folk have enjoyed it as much as I have. So let's make a start. We're going to talk. Well, we'll talk about the book and your background to it and the travels that you went on. I think other people would probably delve a lot deeper into the travels, and we could spend all evening talking about where you've been. But I think you've got so many more interesting reflections that there's a whole load of the stuff that came from the travels that I really want to get into. So we'll probably spend a bit more time on that, about our relationship with the natural world, your thoughts on the role and function of the natural world and how we're involved in it. And maybe getting onto a bit of spirituality, if you want to call it that. But let's start with the easiest stuff. I want to hear about young Cal. Tell us about your childhood and growing up, and where you first got an affinity with the natural world.
Sure. I grew up in the Highlands of Scotland, so quite near Inverness, if you know the area, about half an hour away. And I don't know, I was always quite an outdoorsy child. I especially liked horses and, well, just really like British country wildlife generally. I was obsessed with like Animals of Farthing Wood, all of that kind of stuff. And you used to get like the magazine, and then it was just full of fun facts about foxes and so on. So I guess I was
wait. There was an Animals of Farthing Wood magazine.
What? Yes, you absolutely. I think I have every single copy that ever came out. I've got them in like a special gift set box as well, and I had like all sorts of stuff that came with it, and it just, even just thinking about it now, it gives me a kind of warm and fuzzy feeling inside, just that especially the TV show, though I did like the books as well, were just really loomed large for me as a child.
Wow, there's a cultural reference point I've missed. I'm going to have to go and seek that out. Brilliant, thank you, Cal. So was it Animals of Farthing Wood that gave you an introduction to writing and storytelling as well? Has that always been something you've been interested in?
Yeah, just always. I mean, I think I wrote my first quote unquote book when I was 5. I remember showing it to my mum with great sense of pride. And yeah, I don't know, I've just always been really interested in in writing, it just always seemed to be like a necessary part of sort of dealing with the world or processing the world around me, that kind of thing. And so it just kept on. I suppose I was interested in poetry and fiction and stuff all the way through high school, and when I got to university, I got really into like student journalism, did sort of feature writing, that kind of thing, and tended towards sort of like a stunt journalism. So I did one when I tried to stop myself going to sleep for like 10 days and wrote it up and that kind of thing. So I had a lot of fun on my student newspaper, and made a lot of friends there, and then quite a lot of us tried to sort of make it in newspapers straight out of university. So it was nice to have, I guess, a sort of small crowd of people when we were making a living photocopying at various media outlets. So yeah.
Brilliant. What were you studying?
I studied experimental psychology, which was just the most interesting name of a subject that I could find in a course catalogue, and I genuinely didn't really know that much about it before I studied it, and it was as promised. It was just like generally really interesting, but quite heavy on research methods and stats. It was a degree that was meant to be sort of training us to be researchers, and then I sort of ran aground a bit on the statistics side of it and realized that actually number crunching and using SPSS software wasn't really my calling in life, and wanted to get sort of a little bit more out in the world. So
oh, Cal, you've given me the heebie-jeebies now. You mentioned SPSS. So I did geography and statistics because I failed my A levels miserably. And the only place I could go, I wanted to do geography. The only place I could go was Coventry University, and the only course I could get in on was geography and statistics. So I was like knee deep in SPSS.
Oh God.
And yeah, eventually I was lucky enough to be able to transfer into straight geography. But you've taken me back to a dark place there. Wow, experimental psychology though. What a fab degree. I always think that our authors study such interesting and novel topics. And I can see now why you were doing stunt journalism. I've not heard that phrase before, but I love that. I guess I can sort of see that psychology working its way through into your writing as well.
Yeah, like the thing I really liked about it as a subject was that feeling of sort of arts and sciences really coming together. Like certainly like at the time that I was studying, there was a big push for it to be really scientific, and everything had to be coming from the scientific method and all of this, but the sort of roots of the subject were in philosophy and in these wonderful like big questions. And I think that was the stuff that I really sort of went towards, but it felt like it had a good discipline to it, with the harder science. And so I like that sort of almost like multidisciplinary approach to a single subject. And I think that that's what I try and do when I'm writing about like nature and the natural world, which wasn't what I studied at university. But I think because natural history has had so many wonderful writers, there's definitely quite a lot of space for that like crossover between literature and scientific literature.
It's funny you say that, because one of the things I was going to talk about, so we'll touch on it now, is the orbis smike, which is something that cropped up in your book, and it cropped up in Beyond Adventure last time as well, which was in Joe Shute's book Forecast, where he also talked about the orbis spike, and I think there'd been a paper published on it quite recently. Is that where you picked it up from?
I'm not sure. Is this definitely me? Orbis spike?
The introduction of smallpox to North America and the wiping out.
Oh, I see.
Of populations there, and it just struck me that there was something happening in the scientific community which writers were picking up on, kind of coming out of the woodwork and then translating that into culture. And I think that's a fascinating role for writers, like you were saying about translating science and bringing science into it, but bringing that art side to it. I think it makes for a really interesting approach.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, to some extent, the science of the age really I don't know, it tells us something about culture because it tells us about what we find important enough to research and what we find sort of new and significant. And so in a sense, I do think that sort of more cultural output like literature and music and so on does tend to have quite a lot in common with like the forefront of science and technology.
So what was it that made you want to write this book then? I mean, I think we can see the threads starting to form. We can see the direction that you were going in. But how did you come to the conclusion that you wanted to write a book like this? Because I think it's brilliant and very novel. Where did that inspiration come from?
Well, you know, I've been doing quite a lot of, I guess, nature writing. I contribute regularly to the Guardian Country Diary and similar outlets. And so I'd been quite interested in nature writing as a whole, but I think to make nature writing last at length, it sort of needs to be dealing with quite meaty topics. And often those topics are to do with, I guess, our own interactions with the natural world. So either that's looking at sort of human impacted environments, or it's looking at ethical quandaries. I'm always really interested in the ethics of conservation. And so I guess I was interested in that sort of more, the sort of contested side of our dealings with nature. And so one of those was I was becoming increasingly interested in, I guess, what you might call in scientific terms like anthropogenic landscapes, the ones that are really like human made or human formed. And then this tied in with a visit that I made just for fun with my partner to the Slate Islands, which are off the west coast of Scotland. I don't actually write about them in the book, but this was a sort of precursor to the book. I wrote an essay for a magazine called Avant, which was about the Slate Islands. And these are some really tiny, very pretty islands in Argyll. And during the 19th century, they were like the heart of slate quarrying. And so the tiny islands have got these deep quarries that go much deeper than they are wide, if you see what I mean. And so you get these sort of donut islands, or Easdale, which is the larger of the islands, has, I think, 5 or 6 different quarries. And so from above it, these quarries have over time been flooded with seawater. And then the impurities in the rock has made the seawater that flooded in this like amazing colors of sort of turquoise and cyan. And like from above, it does look like a paint palette. It's an amazing place. And so I went there because I'd heard about it from a landscape artist. And we went there to swim and just have a look at it. And when we got there, I realized that it was sort of covered in brambles and there were loads of small birds and all this kind of thing. So as well as being kind of weirdly beautiful, despite being this post-industrial kind of blasted landscape, it was also beginning to be of sort of environmental value in some way as well. And the more I did reading around that, I wrote this essay on, I guess, the aesthetics of the post-industrial and how you can have, I talked a little bit about Edward Bertinsky, who's this amazing large format photographer. He takes a lot of pictures of things like open cast mines, or my favorite ones of his are like salt pans. So you get these Technicolor pans in the middle of the desert with all the different bacteria and then making them really bright colors. And his art's all about that sort of conflict between like the beauty, but also like the knowledge that these places are really badly impacted by humans and sort of very, very artificial. So I wrote a bit about the aesthetics there, but then the more I read about places like Easdale, post-industrial places and increasingly sort of abandoned places that had been left, I began to see how they could become wild again. There were sort of these feral landscapes, and there was something in that idea. I couldn't quite put my finger on it immediately, but I just knew that there was something quite powerful about it, and then just kept sort of looping around it until I figured out exactly what it was that I was interested in.
And were you looping around it consciously? Was there a time when it crystallized and you went, right, that's it, I've got it?
I think so. In fact, if I think about it now, it was almost fully formed from the beginning. I remember sending I've been chattering with my agent about writing a second book, but it had been taking a very long time and we'd had a couple of stops and starts. And I sent her a paragraph about this sort of abandoned landscape idea, and she was sort of immediately was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And when I look back at it now, it's is really kind of a summary of the book that resulted. So it is amazing how sometimes you just get these sort of insights when you're like, oh, that would work. So yeah, I suppose it did come quite fully formed fairly early on. But then sometimes, I don't know, you know, if you write at length, often you sort of forget where you started and you have to like relearn. So it had like a bit of a sort of, it didn't take that long, but I do remember it being quite stressful, sort of coming up with the idea of like how to structure the book and how many different places I'd need to go and what those places were doing. Because the one issue that I anticipated there being was that if you write about abandoned places, often you just end up telling the same story again and again, which is just like, this place was great and then it was bad, and lots of time has passed. And so the important thing to me was that every place that I went to somehow sort of emblematized a wider issue about abandonment. So I talk about the environmental impacts of abandonment. So beginning quite simply with the way that natural processes allow these places to sort of be recolonized by different species. And then I talk about different forms of pollution and how different species can sort of even sometimes benefit from, say, metal pollution. So there are specific populations of plants that might be able to cope with that, for example. And then I started thinking also about the psychology of it. Partly that's just I'm very interested in psychology, but also I started to see that sort of writing about these places without writing about people, it didn't really make any sense, you know, like by their existence, by their nature, abandoned places are defined by being related to humans. And so I did need to talk about why people want to leave places, you know, like once abandonment starts, why are all these psychological forces essentially come into play that make people leave faster and faster, you know, people start to flood out. So and then why I suppose people find abandoned places very, very drawing. Like what are the positives, I suppose, of abandoned places? Why do we find them so appealing, or certainly sort of emotionally salient? Because I think people do, you know, the more I think about it, I've started talking about it as abandoned places hitting a sort of uncanny valley. So we'll have a spectrum of places from the presently lived in to the total ruin, you know, no signs of human habitation at all, you know, this, talking about sort of very old ruins with grass growing over them. Neither of those are particularly spooky, and somewhere in the middle, when the house has been abandoned, say for, I don't know, 10 years, and you begin to see this sort of mildew coming in, and there's something not quite right about the scene, but it is also recognizably sort of lived in at some point, that starts to get us anxious, and it starts to make us, I don't know, it sort of freaks us out a little bit, but we're also enthralled by it. I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to things like urban exploring. There's something about that eeriness that really sort of piques our interest. And so, yeah, I suppose I was trying to zero in on exactly why these places have this effect.
Wow, with that description, it really brings your choice of places to life, because I can really feel that. Where did you particularly feel that sense then? Where was the place that you went and thought, well, this is a bit too freaky even for me?
I think often, like, I was like confronting like my own cowardice quite a lot while writing this book. So like I would go into places and then you reach these sort of walls, you know, that I'm sort of impressed by so many people who do urban exploring who are just so brave. Like they just really are, not only physically, but with that sort of psychological stress that you feel under, especially in the dark, but just generally in these places. But I think the one that most affected me was the Island of Swona, it's this abandoned island. It's off the north coast of Scotland. I'd been there because I went there, got dropped off and spent 24 hours on it. It's very small, less than a mile in length, and it's got about 9 buildings on it, all in various states of disrepair. And so I got dropped off. I was going to camp inside one of the abandoned houses and get picked up 24 hours later. And I was there because I was very interested in this feral herd of cattle that lives on the island. I was really interested in their behavior. But actually what happened was that chapter got completely railroaded by how freaked out I was by the whole experience of being like extremely alone, I suppose, because you very rarely are in a situation of such intense isolation. And I realized that actually we, I said before, I spend a lot of time with horses, and I'm really interested in sort of animal psychology. And horses are herd animals. They get very edgy if they are not with other horses in sight. They get quite panicky and easily frightened by things. And I realized that I was having exactly the same response, which was just like all sorts of perfectly like, not important things. I would see out the corner of my eye and sort of jump, and I started to feel sick and I couldn't eat. I'd brought plenty of food and sort of tea and coffee and stuff for me to make for myself, and I just couldn't do it, and I tried to sleep at night and lay down, and I just felt sort of like dirty, so that I did have this like very intense psychological response to the whole place. But also you said I could maybe read a section. So this is from the other end of the spectrum. So Swona, like as rural as you can get, really. And then I went to a couple of cities to kind of look at why we can still say that places are abandoned even when they're surrounded by and even still populated by people. And I have a section from the beginning of the Detroit chapter when I just talk about that sort of the different layers of abandonment, I suppose, and how you begin to be able to sense it after a while. So I'll just read a couple of pages if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. So this is from a chapter called The Blight. And it says, the church is red brick, solidly built and comforting, with an ornamental flare under the rake of the roof and in the arches over the windows. The exterior is neat, the guttering and roof tiles done out smartly in scarlet. But the sign that should show the times of service has come away from the wall. Leafed limbs of various autumnal hues have come to rest shyly against the brickwork, prostrate themselves across the stone steps that lead up to heavy wooden doors. That's all that gives it away. After a while, you don't need much. To the discriminating eye, you might as well spray paint it across the facade. Gone to shit, come on in. Some places they do, I guess. Not in so many words. Anyway, it's true. Ran back through a weed-choked courtyard. The door is wide open. Is it possible to enter a church, however desecrated the space, however long since you last raised your voice in prayer, and not feel the cold, firm presence of the sublime? Here it is, streaming in through the windows as clean, clear shafts of light, suffused in the grey and dappled stucco, in the talc of dove-grey plaster that dusts the burnt and broken detritus on the floor. The ceiling is huge and curved, banded like the interior of an enormous barrel, but at its edges, the upper reaches of the walls are bare brick and red or charred charcoal, where a fire has in the past taken hold before dying away. I take a bridle course down the aisle, passing between heavy pews that sit at odd angles. Some have collapsed as if exhausted on the tiles, and to my right, the ragged red velvet of the confessional sags from its rod, tide-lined where filthy rainwater has soaked upwards from the floor. You can feel it in the air, the emotional trace of past epiphanies, crises of faith, funerals, christenings, confirmations, the comings of age. Sheet music that served as a soundtrack to it all has fluttered to the ground and lies damply in clumps like leaves. The grand piano, beached on its side on the floor, is missing its lid, soundboard, and all of its strings. Most of the white keys are gone, and the black hang askew, their long wooden action bared, which gives them the spent look of burnt matches. The curved apse, high above, is a rich cream rimmed in verdigris where the paint has flaked away. At its center, a dove surrounded by a huge sun-like halo has been picked out in gold. A small circular hole through the roof lets the sunlight in, which shines as a spotlight on the floor by the altar. I step into its stream and let myself be anointed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cal. And I think that we sort of skipped over some of the writing stuff at the beginning when we talked a bit about journalism, but I love the way that you bring the places to life. It felt so evocative, and that was just the perfect example of kind of how you've crystallized this moment on a page, and it's something I'm always in awe of writers. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for reading it.
That's very kind.
You mentioned about being in Swona and being really alone. And I wanted to ask anyway about whether whether when you experience these places with other people, how that changed the experience for you. Because like I mentioned to you beforehand, I never listen to other people's interviews with people that I'm going to interview, because I find it, I inadvertently pick up some of their thinking and their line of thought, and I don't want to do that. I want to come to these fresh, because I think that's what the authors deserve. Do you get the same sense of going to places? What's the difference between going somewhere with someone else and visiting on your own?
That's interesting. I think they are very qualitatively different. And I think sometimes I was definitely sort of like, for Swona, for example, I knew that it would be quite important to go on my own, just because it was such an extreme example of being alone and isolated. But saying that, like, it's always balanced with sort of practicalities. So I needed to get a lift onto the island. I wasn't sure until right at the last minute that I would be there for a night. The Inchkeith chapter, actually, which is, well, it's not really a chapter, it's like the beginning. I call it the evocation, it's really the introduction. I actually went out to the islands with a group of ornithologists who were there to go and do a bird count, and sort of we all went together on a chartered boat. They dropped me off and walked around to a different bit of the island, and we're just like, all right, see you later. So I was wandering through the fort on my own, but I wasn't completely alone on the island. So I think, I don't know, you do need to be looking for, if you're writing rich descriptions of stuff, often that is very linked to your emotions. So whatever you need to do something to feel a place very strongly. Going somewhere on your own is quite a sort of easy way of doing that, because you feel things so intensely, because you're very undistracted. But I don't think that you necessarily need to be on your own, as long as you're paying a great deal of attention. I think the act of paying attention is often enough to make you feel a place more intensely. I suppose that's why people are so into mindfulness and so on. And I think that writing, or the demands of research, can be very similar. Like I take my notepad and I'm constantly writing down stuff in case it's useful later. I mean, the number of notes that I end up actually using will be like 1% or less than what I write at the time. It's just like random scrappy observations that might or might not be useful later. But I do think that that is a very good method of sort of making you, I don't know, get onto the same wavelength as a place. And then in a couple of places, especially the urban places, I went with, I suppose, like local urban explorers or people who somehow, like in Detroit, so I went out for a day with the Michigan Humane Society looking for stray dogs. And actually that ended up being great. I had so much fun with them, and they had amazing access to stuff. So a lot of the really famous urban ruins in Detroit are sort of now guarded to stop people going in. So the very biggest abandoned factory right in the center of the city, and it goes on for like half a mile. It's huge, but it's now surrounded by cameras since Detroit became this sort of urban exploration capital of the world, with full of people going in and like setting fires to stuff and taking photos. Whereas we went in with the dog catchers, and then sort of the security guard turned up and was like, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And then they were like, Elise, how are you doing? And then we got sort of free reign to roam through the building. So that was quite cool, actually. And so going with people can be a real benefit. And it can just make, I don't know, I feel like they gave me a great sense of Detroit, the city, and I had a really great time there. And that's much harder to do if you're not speaking to local people. Even if you're writing about abandoned places, if you're writing about urban abandonment, you have to talk to people, because otherwise you're just going off like your notions of what a place might be like based on like your reading or something. So you do really need to, try and get on that place's wavelength. And sometimes that involves talking to people. And I think having a background, I was a news reporter for a while, and although I found that a very demanding job, sort of just because my temperament doesn't totally, I don't know, tune with it, because you have to be quite sort of pushy and always be talking to people. It did sort of teach me that I have to talk to people, and that actually that's not the end of the world, and you can start a conversation with almost anyone, and most people will chat. So I find that to be a useful thing, and that's not something that comes naturally to me. I have to have to sort of push through shyness often to make sure that I have those conversations.
Again, what you've described there is it really frames why the book just works so beautifully. You've got that ability to engage with others, but also that ability to engage with the stillness of the place. And I think the confluence of those two in the writing is its real strength. And clearly, when you went to Slab City, you had to do a lot of engaging with people. And when I read the book, actually, I just like 2 days beforehand or something watched Nomadland, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I know this place, and it was a really quite a visceral connection. That must have been quite a profound sort of place to be, really. What does it feel like being there? Does it feel lawless?
Yes, it does. I think the best, I think about Slab City all the time because it really thrilled me, but it also really scared me. And I think that it had that, like, a huge amount of appeal, but then after sort of, I don't know, about 36 hours there, I began to feel like this sort of like nagging sensation of not feeling safe and not really understanding. I think maybe if I hung out there for sort of weeks at a time, I might be able to feel like I understood this kind of social cues that were going on. But I felt, I think the best way to describe Slab City is like, there's been a massive festival, and this is it like 2 days after the festival officially ended. So it's like loads of people in the desert. They've built these encampments. There's lots of just like random trash blowing around in the desert. Everyone's having kind of a great time, but it's tinged with something quite dark. And I mean, it has, I mean, what's that, the Burning Man Festival? I mean, it's very similar aesthetically to Burning Man Festival, except Burning Man Festival is quite, I don't know, relatively clean cut compared to this place. This place is, it's yeah, I don't know, it's very intense, and I think that everyone who's there is very proud of being a slabber, or the people I spoke to, certainly. I mean, it's a big community, and especially the time of year that I was there, it was really like the intense Slab City residents, because it was at the hottest time of the year. So it was like, at some stages it can be like 50 degrees centigrade in the desert, and these people are completely self-supported, so they've got their own water. People who are in RVs often have AC, but a lot of people, probably most of the people who were living there at the time that I was there, do not have RVs and are just living in sort of tents that they've constructed. And so it's a really intense environment. A lot of people are sleeping pretty rough in the desert, but they're there kind of also to have a good time. And the reason that they're there is that they're trying to cut loose and get free, and that's why it's thrilling. But it's also why it's feels quite threatening. There are people moving through who are clearly completely drugged up. There's a lot of weapons around. And there was kind of this slightly strange vibe.
Yeah, no, you got the strange. No, if you don't, I'm gonna pop back in because you did a reading. As we were talking there, I thought I love. There's a bit there that I really liked. So if you don't mind, I'm going to do it.
Oh yeah, go ahead, please.
So this is from The Deluge in the Desert. It's a bit shorter than yours. So it says, as I pass, my eyes track the ramshackle cells of the anchorites. Who knows what they're driven by? God or drugs or mental breakdown. But they're not alone in their practice of desert retreat. It was a biblical wilderness, a desolate, waterless, featureless desert where Moses saw the burning bush, where Elijah wandered when he alone was left among the faithful, and where the Lord came to him in a small, still voice. I no longer have a God, but I sometimes feel him anyway. Then you quote, I did know thee in the wilderness, in the land of great doubt. In the desert, fear must turn into faith. I loved that. I thought it was great. So I wondered, you talked about no longer having a God. But do you think you've in your work now, do you think you've found some sort of some other connection or some other sense of a god? That seemed to be what you were hinting at there.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that that's why a lot of us find nature writing so engaging, right? It's this like search for something bigger than ourselves, and I don't know, I think this search for epiphany in place. So I think that is particularly what I like when I read other people's works, is when people are sort of interacting with the world around them. So for example, I just love the writing of Amy Liptrot. She wrote The Outrun, and she's got a new book coming out. And whenever she's out in a landscape, she's never just like going for a walk and looking at birds. She's like running naked around a stone circle, or she's like swimming in the Atlantic Ocean and it's whipping her face, this kind of thing. I think it is the sense of like outer forces like working on us, and however that manifests to you. I don't know, I guess I did to some extent grow up in the church, as in I went to Sunday school and I went to sort of scripture union camps when I was younger, although we weren't a particularly sort of a obviously observant family. I think that the prosody of the King James Bible is really like leached into my brain, and I think I was often moved by the readings that we did then. And although that I haven't gone on to be a practicing Christian, I do think that there is something in religion that touches many of us. And so I think that that's why in my own writing, I keep sort of reverting to that when I'm looking to sort of express those bigger emotions. I sort of revert to that kind of register, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it makes sense, and possibly it makes sense because I think I probably had quite a similar upbringing in the Church of England. I'm not religious in that Christian sense anymore, but I guess you soak up a lot of that. You kind of take it on board, don't you? I loved you said something magical there. You said a search for epiphany in place. Is that a phrase that you've thought of before, or did that just appear on your lips then?
It's something I think I'm interested in now. Like people have been asking, like, am I working on a new book? And I'm finding it very hard to say that yes, because I haven't got that. I said I had that paragraph when suddenly Islands of Abandonment made sense. I haven't got that far yet, but I think that's the idea I'm circling around at the moment, that sort of crossover between spirituality and landscape, and like what we're looking for when we walk out into quote unquote wilderness.
Wow. Well, we have a rule in these conversations: we don't talk about next books because it can go both ways. Because sometimes subscribers can go, "Oh, well, brilliant! So Tim will feature Cal's next book," and they might not buy it, and I might not feature it, or they might think, "Oh, well, there's a new book coming out, so I'll go out and buy it, and then I feature it, and then they've already got it." In which case, they get a refund.
Okay.
And they get to keep the other book. So that's how it works. So I try not to do it. But that sounds really...
It's a very long way off, I have to say. Don't hold your breath.
But that sounds fabulous. And almost, I think a lot of the books that we talk about, they're edging around the idea of an epiphany in place. And I guess it goes back to some of the earliest nature writing and awe and wonder and the sublime, really. Do you? I mean, you as all authors tend to. You've got some good touchstones, some good quotes in there. Do you have any favoured sort of literature or writers or thinkers that you have sort of taken inspiration from, apart from James Lovelock? We'll talk about James Lovelock later on.
I think in this book, probably the person whose writing I maybe thought was most relevant, especially in terms of form and maybe interest, was Elizabeth Colbert. So she wrote this wonderful book called The Sixth Extinction, which did something a little bit similar in terms of she moved around the world. Actually, in her case, she was speaking to lots of different people who were sort of working to prevent extinctions. And through their stories, she she did something that was like a bigger narrative that tied it all together, that was looking at the history of the idea of extinction. And I think just the way that she structured that book and the way that she managed to make all of these disparate episodes come together into one thing was something that I took a lot of inspiration from. And she's also very interested in tying together like history and science and also contemporary human stories, and slightly less, I suppose, like naturey landscape writing, but it's in there. I mean, she's a very beautiful writer. So I think Elizabeth Colbert, and then in terms of the more sort of like florid, frilly stuff, I'm absolutely obsessed with like Annie Dillard. So like she's amazing. She has this great quote that she sort of talks about how you can either be a nun and wreck your heart in prayer, or you can sort of be someone who goes out into the world and observe it and write about it. Like her, you know, like to her, this is her choice in life. You know, she can be a nature writer, you know, like keening up to the divine, or she could have gone to a convent and done the same thing in a different form. So I mean, she's incredible.
I can see how that would have resonated. I mean, it's funny you mentioned about Elizabeth there and the history side, because I loved the historic references in this, and I guess that sort of possibly comes a little from your other book, where you're doing a bit more history of colonialism, and we'll talk a bit about colonialism in a minute. But one of the bits that I was most amazed about was when you talked about the Lewis and Clark Discovery Expedition, and from our modern Western mindset, you know, we think of them as going into the wilderness, this unspoilt wilderness, and yet you shared how they went through vastly different ecosystems which had been shaped by mankind, and I don't think that's something that I'd necessarily appreciated before. Was that new to you, or did that come out through as you were researching the book?
I think that particular tidbit about sort of the effect of warring Native American nations on sort of populations of animals came out specifically from the research, but I had come across similar narratives of quote unquote exploration while I was writing about Australia and the exploration there. And that sense of, you know, like you come across people from a culture you don't recognize, and there's this sense of like parallel narratives, you know, like that we see it through one set of eyes, and then suddenly you're extremely aware of there being another way of looking, and they're looking back at you. And I think that to some extent, that I don't know, that I find that quite mind-blowing, you know, when you read historical descriptions like that, and you try and imagine seeing it from everyone's point of view. And then I suppose what I was also trying to do, especially in later chapters when I was talking about the natural world, is try and imagine the narrative or the point of view in the absence of people. So, you know, like what's going on when we're not there to watch it. Of course, you know, there are narratives going on, and all the other species have their agendas, and I think that's quite mind-bending when you try and sort of remove yourself from the equation but still try and imagine everything else going on. I think we find that very difficult to tune into. That's a slightly, sorry, I drifted there.
No, nothing to apologize about from that. That's bang on. That's absolutely brilliant, because it's empathy, isn't it? It's being able to look at a situation through another's eyes, and yes, those might be an indigenous population that you've just come across and found in the middle of their own grand narrative, or it could be it could be the flora and fauna, and trying to imagine it from their experience. Definitely nothing at all to apologize for there. I think it's fab. So I think one of the, carrying on that theme of man's influence over the natural world, and sort of this, well, our colonization of the natural world, that definitely seems such a strong theme that comes through it, and I definitely got a sense that you know, you're really saying that actually we're better just leaving it alone, guys. You know, you had a great phrase about we need to surrender control to the process of the natural world. Did you always feel that then, or was that a conclusion that you came to from pulling the book together?
I think both. I think I have been that first book that I wrote about colonialism and learning, I suppose, to sort of look at language, not only that was used in the past, but how sort of past, well, racist attitudes, I suppose, continue to impact the way that we think now. Made me recognize some of the language and ways of thinking that we have about other things, so other aspects, and that includes the way that we think about the natural world. So you can see, I guess, what I've come to think of as kind of the colonial mindset in some writing about conservation, and in which we talk about sort of going in to fix things. I guess that sense of feeling like we know best, that feels to me a little bit like it mirrors other instances in the past when we've been so certain and we've actually done a great deal of harm. And so I suppose I've got this slightly like anxiety-ridden way of dealing with people who seem certain about things, because I'm so uncertain about everything. And so I think I do see colonial language echoed in lots of ecology and conservation, and I began to worry, I suppose, that maybe that indicated that we might be thinking in ways that we're trying to move away from in terms of how we deal with other people, but we perhaps don't recognize in ourselves when we deal in, I don't know, different planes, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it definitely does. And you quoted another great naturalist. So you quoted Muir when he said, "Tug at anything in nature, and I'm sort of forgetting the quote, and you find everything else is attached to it." And I definitely got the sense that you're pushing back against the narrative that I think most of our community would push back against as well, of a separation between humankind and the natural world. Where did you take that? Because I was thinking, and you talk a little bit about invasive species and native species, and it almost struck me that really, because we are an agent of introducing what we call invasive species, then actually it's strangely part of a natural process, because we're part of nature and we've introduced them. Did you get a sense of that? Because that leads on to we've introduced these things, so we've got to get rid of them. It's a strange duality. I find that we can hold both those ideas in our head. I'm not even asking you a question here. I'm
no, that's fine. But no, there's such a, because invasive species actually is you talk about plants colonizing, you talk about them naturalizing, you talk about them being aliens or exotics, all of this kind of thing. I mean, and it's not just in the language, but also in the way that we think about invasive species. And there is a lot of sort of fright around sort of quote unquote like foreign species invading from abroad. There's a really great, well, basically there's a lot of controversy going on in science at the moment around this idea of invasive species, how worried we need to be, and when we need to intervene and when we shouldn't. And obviously this is hugely knotty subject. There's no obvious right answer. That's why it's interesting to write about from my point of view. But there's a great book by Fred Pearce, a new scientist writer, and he really sort of sums up a lot. He's been covering this for decades. It's called The New Wild, and he talks about how maybe, you know, as you were suggesting there, you know, like the spread of species around the world is a natural process that is happening all the time. Humans have greatly speeded it up enormously, but at the same time, you know, like to some extent it increases biodiversity, it is also one of the processes by which the planet might adapt to rising temperatures. We'll start to see different species arriving in different places. So we are seeing sort of en masse the march of species north as the climate changes. And so I think conservationists are very accepting of the need not to be sort of harking back to some Edenic past. We don't have a fixed point that they're trying to get back to, but there is this sense of trying to return things to pre-humans or pre-industrial age in lots of thinking, even if once you dig into it, you can't define exactly when this sort of perfect time was. I mean, people are very aware of that, but the question is, when does it make sense for us to accept that the planet is changing and that the movement of species and the changing assemblage of species in various habitats is simply part of our future, and we need to accept it? And yeah, as I say, it's a gray area, and so there's lots to argue over here.
Lots to write books about.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is such a thorny and a knotty issue, and it's one that it's so hard to get right. I've not come across Fred Pearce. I will look him up. But I guess in that sort of thinking, I was influenced a bit by James Lovelock and his thinking, and I know he gets a couple of mentions in the book. And in that spirit of, what's the best thing that we can do? I'd not come across his idea of actually deliberately contaminating places so that it moves humans out of the way and then forces us to do nothing. So we have this one-off intervention and then bugger off out of the way and just leave the natural world to get on with it. And at first it shocked me. And then actually I thought, wow, maybe he's onto something there.
Yeah, I think what he's so good at is posing these thought experiments. Like from my point of view, I know that the Gaia theory is in fact very technical and has been worked out. I think he worked with, is it Lynn Margolis he worked with? So they have run a lot of calculations and simulations and so on. But from my point of view, it is a helpful thought experiment to help us understand how sort of these self-righting mechanisms or negative feedback loops might work on a global basis. And then the opposite, equal and opposite, is the Medea model, which has come up to show us the nightmare scenario, what might happen when we start getting positive feedback loops and we start seeing, I think you were talking about this with Tams and Omand, sort of, we start seeing things like changing ocean currents or methane escaping from permafrost and so on, and all of these things make the planet sort of spiral out of control. And ultimately, in the Medea hypothesis, it's sort of the opposite of Gaia in that it's almost like a suicidal planet. And I think for me, it's more like you can hold them up as ways of thinking and understanding the world. And that's what James Lovelock has been so good at. He's great at posing these really provocative ideas that make us think. And like exactly with this one, it's just a kind of a throwaway comment that he made in a newspaper column once, and then it made sort of big splash, which was, like, do we leave contaminated nuclear contamination in beautiful areas to scare people off from going in them? I mean, like, even better if you tell people that you're going to do that and then you don't actually do it, but enough to scare people off, and where's the trade-off? I guess that's what I'm talking about in the Chernobyl chapter, which is like, where does the absence of human intervention and human pollution and human damage, where does that sort of trade off with the trade-off between human intervention and presence with the damage that has been done to the region? It has to be enough that it scares people into leaving. So where does that balance lie? Is the Chernobyl exclusion zone overall a positive story or not? And I think, you can't really argue that. Obviously, like, enormous, particularly, social and at the time sort of very acute human impact means that it's sort of distasteful, I think, to think of it as an overall positive story. But like, in terms of environmental, if you talk about that element of it, you can say, well, many species are not exactly doing better because of the radiation, but they are surviving, and they're surviving in much greater numbers than they did before, simply because they've been given the space and they don't know to avoid the area. So yeah, I don't know. I think that is one of James Lovelock's thought experiments made real, that whole place.
And you did moot the idea of doing a little reading from your section of Chernobyl. Would that work? Is
yes,
that a
let
good
me
bit?
just make sure I can bring it up. Sorry, bear with me.
No, it's not a problem.
Here we are. Okay, I'll just read a few paragraphs from right at the end of that chapter. The zone is full of hot spots. Sometimes they've been marked by small yellow lollipop signposts, whose triangular faces wear the nuclear trefoil, the international symbol for ionizing radiation, in red. These signs are planted throughout the zone, marking places to avoid. They're not dangerous exactly, but you shouldn't stand there long. At the city limits, we pass another on the side of the road. Can we stop? I say, and the driver shrugs. I get out and cross to the verge by the sign and keep stepping until I hear the warble of the dosimeter. All I see is a field of thick, tussocky grass poking through a thin layer of snow. Ungrazed, unmown. Pine seedlings are bristling on the edges of the clearing amid a shimmer of birch. Thin upper limbs of russet and wine over silvered, glimmering torsos. A thin white mist hangs about a foot over the ground, ethereal, waiting to be parted. It started to snow. Heavy flakes fall in slow motion onto my hair, my crown. I shut my eyes, feeling cold fingers touching my face, and visualize the radiation washing over me, bathing me in a current of which I'm only abstractly aware, whose existence is a matter of faith. It's one thing to understand the concept in a lecture, I think, another altogether to comprehend your body at the mercy of it. It takes a certain mystical frame of mind, one I'm not unfamiliar with. I surrender myself to it, to its greater power. I feel my boundaries blur, grow indistinct. Gamma rays pass through me on their way elsewhere. After a minute or so, I step away and hear the siren fall to a crackle. I feel nothing, I think. I'm not afraid.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cal. Do you know we don't often do readings during these conversations, but I think it's testament to the strength of the writing that we've drawn more out. It's been really enjoyable. Thank you. We're knocking on for 9 o'clock, so I think it's probably time to draw it to a close. But there was one last bit. I always like to end on a hopeful note, and of all the books, this is the reason why I chose your book to go alongside Tamsin's, is it's so filled with hope, even though it deals with such difficult issues. And there's a lovely line where you say, this should be a book of darkness, a litany of the worst places in the world, but it's not. But I wondered, from all your research, what's the thing that gives you the most hope for the future?
I think actually the chapter on carbon sinks in abandoned farmland was the thing that gave me most, I guess, concrete hope for the future. I know a lot of people who work in environmental campaigning I think they don't really want to talk too much about carbon sinking because they feel it's a distraction. We need to stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere at sort of full stop, basically. And so they don't want to get into the idea that you can sort of offset carbon and so on. But I think what is very interesting about and heartening, I think, about the abandoned farmland is the sense that constantly in the background there are these natural forces working to, not to save us, because that's not, there is no narrative like that. They are not actively trying to do anything, but the regrowth of forest, which is happening on a massive scale, particularly across the former Soviet Union, but also in other places around the world, in fact, all across the developed and middle income world, we're seeing massive regrowth of trees. partly this is due to people moving out of what they would call marginal farmland, so less profitable farmland. There's a huge amount of urbanization. There's increasingly falling populations in developed countries, and we're also seeing slight increasing growth because of rising temperatures, although that's not great. But it's happening on such an enormous scale. And within these sort of new forests, our self-made forests, you have a weird mix of species, admittedly, because they're self-organizing, but they're more promising in terms of how much carbon they can keep. They're more promising in terms of the different species that you get there. They're very biodiverse compared to plantations. Learning about these self-formed forests has made me realize that actually trying to plant trees to soak up carbon is the wrong way of thinking about it. What we need to be doing is allowing trees to plant themselves. They can do it on such a big scale and for free, and much better than we can hope to do it. So that's, I think, a very strong example of when we need to simply get out of the way and sort of surrender land for these sort of future forests. And I think that the scale that it's happening on is very impressive. It's not enough to nowhere near enough to cancel out, you know, the emissions that we continue to give out. But should we stop, there is this process by which some of the carbon we've already emitted into the atmosphere might be tied down again. And I think that just that sense of there being these forgiving forces out there in the world has, I don't know, I felt gave me a lot of hope. It made me feel like if we could do the right thing, if we could somehow learn to live more lightly on the earth, then there are things that might swing into action to help sort of avert crisis. And I think that that's probably temperamentally, it depends how you feel. A lot of people are energized by the anxiety fueled narratives about how we need to stop right now. I think people who are like me, you need a sense of hope to keep working, right? You don't feel hopeless and just give up. So I think I was explicitly looking to find hope, but also I think that it's important that we have it.
Absolutely. Without hope, we are certainly doomed. I mean, there's no two ways about it. But I love that the idea that there are forgiving forces out there. I think is great, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that was the thing that we learned from the conversation with Tamsin is that we will burn ourselves out if we're not careful, and we need to find ways that we can give ourselves hope for the future. And that was absolutely brilliant. Cal, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful book. It's been a wonderful conversation. Just brilliant. Just on every level, bloody brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. And thanks. I'm just reading a couple of really nice messages people sent, so thank you so much for that.
Yeah, no, thanks Gemma and Bob. They're lovely messages. Yes, hopefully the people at COP26 have read it. We're not going to talk about COP26 because we're ending on a helpful note. So it's all good. Cal, it's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. We will definitely look out for the next book. I think Finding Epiphany in Place sounds great, but for now, forgiving forces out there working to help us out if we do the right thing is a wonderful note to end on. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Cal. And yeah, well, we'll do it all again in a month's time with another mystery book. Thank you all. I will end it there. Cal, see you later.
Good night. Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much. I had a great time. Bye.
Good.